Okay, so I'm back yet again. This is another real quick one, and it's going over something I forgot about with my previous video, and it has to do with Steve's stance, Lionheart, which you can access in many different ways. So the thing about this stance is, let me go ahead and select the one where he stands around. So the main thing about this stance is he does a little shimmy, you know? This allows him to sort of fake out his timings, delay his techniques, so on, whatever. The issue with Lionheart, or at least originally before it was patched, is that he didn't have any way of checking armor moves. Even on hit, this is a simulation of the previous effect because the one option now checks armor moves in this situation on hit from a back 1-2. You could just armor through and cover his options. Now, the thing about this is the original sort of implementation of this idea of the Lionheart stance on hit is that you would sort of proactively respond to whatever your opponent is doing. So you see how he was able to sway past my armor move here. So I'll use a tracking move in order to get him. Pretty straightforward. So in that case, he can change up what he does. I got hit. In anticipation of my high, he goes into Snake Charmer instead, and he's rewarded with a launch. And in that case, I'd want to do a mid poke, and we're back in the same situation where he's gone, and he just punished me. This sort of proactive, fast, rapid-fire decision-making is sort of what they wanted you to do with Lionheart. The issue is the implementation was fairly weak, and it's a lot to juggle whenever you're playing as Steve and you're making use of this stance, because at any moment your opponent could just bust out the no U button, and there's no sort of safe alternative for you to make use of. This is exaggerated considerably whenever you're in Rage, because Rage Arts are nothing more than a super armor move, and they also have much better tracking than normal armor moves, if, you know, the armor move has tracking at all. Which means Steve can put himself in checkmate situations unintentionally just by using Lionheart or attempting to use Lionheart. So, how does this fit into my previous video's topic on stances and parries and so on and whatever? Well, whenever Steven enters into heat mode, Lionheart gains an additional property, and this property is the ability to reverse mids. You notice how I said reverse and not parry. The reason I said reverse is actually intentional, because for one reason or another, despite this being unlisted on its properties, he cannot reverse elbows. So it works more like a sabaki in that case, right? A sabaki or a reversal, not a parry. And if you go into his move list, even though it's grayed out, the text is quite hard to see. What can be done during Heat Unique? Can parry mid attacks during Lionheart. Mid attacks. Take a mid attack from an opponent during Lionheart. It's not particularly explicit or defined. Either way though, this is a defensive mechanic like any of the other ones, and it should be prone to the same weaknesses, right? So let me start with a Heat Smash. There goes that strong reversal break, the glass shattering. That means the hypothesis sort of checks out, you know? It is indeed a defensive technique, and it can be shattered through, using the appropriate abilities. Let me try throwing. Oh, something's not right here. Already. So, I'm throwing him, sure. And hypothetically, a Steve player could, you know, he could use Snake Charmer and get away from my throw. That's one thing he could do. Well, that's awkward. I'll use a slightly slower throw. There we go. That illustrates what should have happened in the first place. But if you're paying attention, you'll notice something's a little bit missing here. There wasn't a specific effect that shows whenever you throw a parry type move. Okay, so my example's ready this time. But as I was saying, something was missing from the interaction there when I let him sit. So let's see. Interestingly enough, he can break throws, despite being within a parry state, or a reversal state rather. It it's yet another inconsistency. And it's something that's really hard to justify because I'm not sure what's going on here. As far as the thought process is under the hood with the game itself, I don't know what the game is thinking, and I don't know what the developers have told the game to think. So I don't really know how to interpret something like this. So Steve is in a state where he can reverse mid attacks. Any and all mid attacks, with some exceptions. This is poorly defined within the moveset, and I'd understand if a Steve player was eating elbows in Lionheart and being confused with why his defensive maneuver is not triggering. I mean, and yet this elbow still is hitting me. So that's one thing. That's something that should probably be specified on the move list because it's pretty stupid for it not to be. And it's pretty annoying too. And the next thing is, unlike other similar moves, Steve isn't vulnerable to throws. This isn't just Steve himself. There are other exceptions. And I'm not sure all of them are intentional. I'm certainly not sure if this one's intentional. Especially since he already has a built-in counter for throws. It didn't work again. Built into the behavior of the stance itself, his ability to sway. I also want to add, as far as Lionheart is concerned and the various buffs that Steve got over the course of the game, after sitting on it for a little bit, I understand what the initial idea was, and I think that changes that they've made to Lionheart actually sort of break this fundamental design idea. So the original idea would be, yeah, I'd use my arm. If I have a mid armor move like Dragunov does, I would use it. My opponent would anticipate the behavior, and he would get the opportunity for additional damage. If I had a high armor move instead, we're going to pretend that the move I do is an armor move for the sake of this. Then he would use Snake Charmer and get under it, and again, get the opportunity for some major hits. The issue of this is it's not particularly practical at most levels of play, and it puts a lot of the onus on the attacker when they've already succeeded in the situation. The fact that this situation can play out on hit, off of back 1-2 on hit, for example, which is just his 13 frame Punisher, is really strange when you have a game with characters like Dragunov, for example, who can throw you in very deadly looping like pressure situations very easily, and they can do so with little risk to themselves. The only anticipation I need for any of your defensive abilities, whether it be an armor move, a rage art, any kind of parry or reversal off of a quarter circle forward 2, is literally to dash up and do nothing. I can feint movement, and I can even bait out some kind of response from you safely because I'm not in a stance, and this is on block. Steve can hit his opponent and still need to think about the way they're going to behave afterwards. That's why the Lionheart changes were made, but especially since the stance originally was made in such a way that you can't cancel out of it. You're forced to go into it, and you're put into a vulnerable state where you can't guard. You're more or less forced to make a read. The thing is, Steve sways sort of mitigate this somewhat by limiting the number of viable counterattacks your opponent can throw out, as I showed just a little bit ago. The first one should be the sway. As you can see, Steve can get past a whole lot of things. Sure, he loses to tracking moves, but being able to do this without heat is already strong in its own right. The issue comes in again if I were hypothetically in rage. In this situation, it'll depend on your Rage Art now that I think about it. But I can just Rage Art, and it'll hit him. There's not really much interactivity on his end. He's more or less just cooked, and that's why you don't always want to go into Lionheart. But it's interesting because that's a design problem with the way Rage Arts work more than how Lionheart works. If the listed property of reverses mids while in heat worked as described, then I'd actually be absolutely fine with Stevens being forced to enter into Lionheart and not being able to cancel it by holding back. Because then they could just literally stand there if they anticipate the Rage Art. And then they'd get their clinch and their opportunity for follow-ups. But for some reason, things are becoming more convoluted in all of these attempts to make the systems more simple. Rage Arts are a strong reversal break. They go through everything, unless you're Devil Kazuya for some reason. All of these extra things are layered on top of each other. Changes are made without consideration for how they play into the game's narrative or the ecosystem of the game itself and how things exist and coexist and interact. And it's just a big mess. So I ended up talking about Lionheart a little more than I thought, but that about wraps up the discussion on it, because there's not really anything else to say. Lionheart's another exception to various reversal rules that should be cohesive at this point, or at least understandable, and they just aren't.